As I said, the census of 1890 declared that the frontier of the continent was closed to the United States and that westward settlement had ceased on the continent. But this did not mean that the United States had finished with its expansion. We're now going to look at Imperial America, the transition of the United States over the change of the 19th to the 20th century in which the United States becomes a world power. We're going to look at populism and the movement that continues today that we see as populism. We'll see African American gains and losses, the elections of 1888, 1890, and 1892, the Panic of 1893, the election of 1896, a splendid little war, and the United States becomes an imperial power. The man in the picture there that you see dominates the American political scene, although he never became president of the United States. His name is William Jennings Bryan. He is the great commoner from the state of Alaska. He came out of the American heartland preaching a populist message and captured the Democratic Party in the hearts and minds of the Democratic followers, and 3 times was a candidate for president of the United States. Let us first look at populism. Populism is a movement that attacks the existing political power structure, saying that it has become decrepit and corrupt, out of touch with the American people, and so forth. It mobilizes the people against big business and or political interests. Here we see for the very first and really the only time a real attempt at a third party in the United States. We have been very comfortable, despite what we may say, with a two-party system in this country. In the 1880s and the 1890s, you had populism that threatened to put a dent into both political parties. What was the Populist Party's platform? They were anti-monopoly, so you notice that they're going against big business. They wanted more extensive democracy. That means more voters and more voting participation directly in government. Pursuant to this, they pursued things like initiative and referendum. Initiative means that any private citizen can bring up an item for voting and legislation. Referendum means that people actually do vote upon that. In 1892, the Populist Party ran James Weaver for the presidency, and he did rather well, I must say, even though he did not win. In the 1890s, in the 1880s and the 1890s, African Americans made a series of gains as well as losses. The civil rights cases of 1883 were the last civil rights cases that would be brought before Congress and brought before the court until the 1950s. The civil rights cases of 1883 came before the court, and it ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional and allowed for private businesses to continue segregation. As Northern troops had left the South, Southern redeemers now were doing their very best to disenfranchise African Americans, especially through what is known as the poll tax. The poll tax set a fee for registering to vote and for being able to cast a vote. And oftentimes it was set at a fee like $1 per vote, per voting election and so forth, And many people who were poor and on the verge of destitution could not afford to spend $1 voting when $1 could feed a family for a month. And when the poll tax didn't work, literacy tests and so forth, then you had what was known as the Second Mississippi Plan. We'll just scare them away from the polls, intimidate them away from the polls, do everything they can to keep them away from the polls. So this was a time of retreat for African Americans in this period. But there was movement forward in other ways. Booker T. Washington, the man you see there to the right, encouraged African Americans to pursue excellence, especially in education. Educate yourselves. Be the best that you can be. And in order to follow up on this, he helped establish the Tuskegee Institute. so that young scientists could be culled from the ranks of African Americans. And Booker T. Washington makes a decision to go along with the aspects of racial segregation and disenfranchisement called the Atlanta Compromise. In return for refusing to agitate strongly for African American civil rights, white power brokers and business leaders agreed to ease up restrictions in other areas and also helped fund a series of African American charities. Booker T's basic mantra was, the time is not right, we don't have the power, let us wait and get our power in order, let us raise ourselves up and then put ourselves in a position where they have to deal with us. Many people called Booker T. Washington a traitor for this. In 1896, a man by the name of Homer Plessy got on the New Orleans to Covington Railroad line and announced that he was an African American. He was sitting in the white section of the railroad car. He was ordered to move to the colored section of the railroad car, and when he refused, he was arrested. This was all done with prior knowledge. This was a big-time setup. Everybody knew what was coming. And Plessy was taken to Orleans Parish Prison, where he was booked, and put on trial before Judge John Ferguson of the Orleans Parish Criminal District Court, where he was found guilty of violating the segregated cars on the New Orleans to Covington Railroad. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And there you had the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, on which sat the Honorable Edward Douglas White, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from the state of Louisiana. And there the famous separate but equal clause came into play, in which the court says that segregation is legal as long as things are kept equal. That was the key. Separate but equal. With the separate but equal passage of Plessy v. Ferguson, and by the way, the site where Homer Plessy got on the railroad is down on Press Street in the Bywater District. They have refurbished the Press Street station and made it into a little row of shops and restaurants. This gave governments the right to now go ahead and segregate everything, and everything was segregated. Even jails and whorehouses were segregated. And so segregation comes into play. But there was a precipitous decline in lynching after the segregation laws were passed in the wake of Plessy v. Ferguson, because whites were less fearful of blacks because they felt that government was able to do something about them, and so they did not feel the need to take the law into their own hands. I am in no way justifying the Plessy v. Ferguson case. I am simply informing you of the consequences. There was also, in the 1890s, a new wave of nativism directed against new immigrants, especially those from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, most notably Italians. And again, in the city of New Orleans in 1891, the police chief of New Orleans, David Hennessy, was shot and killed, ostensibly by a member of the mafia, which led to a trial, acquittal of several Italians, and then a white mob stormed the Orleans Parish Prison and lynched 7 of the men. It almost caused the United States and Italy to go to war with each other, and the Pope even threatened to put New Orleans under the interdict, which meant that the churches would have been closed and those sacraments would have been dispensed. Things were pretty messy for a while down here in good old New Orleans. And by the way, that happened right where the Superdome is located today. In 1888, Grover Cleveland stood for election again as President of the United States, and he won the popular vote. But Benjamin Harrison of the Republican Party, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, former president who served for a grand total of 31 days, he wins the electoral vote. Neither Cleveland nor Harrison are really the dominant figures of this age. The dominant figure is the Republican Speaker of the House, Thomas Brackett Reed, Boss Reed as he was called. For those of you who are political science majors and study civics and so forth, you note the rules of the House of Representatives and the way in which bills are brought to the floor and so forth. Thank you, Thomas B. Reed. He is the one that established the rules for bringing legislation to the floor of the House. And with Reed's rules in place, legislation comes forward. First of all, you had the Tariff Act of 1890, brought forth by Representative William McKinley of Ohio, who would later become the President of the United States. You had a force bill that was brought to the floor to ensure voting rights, both in the North and in the South. You had the Sherman Antitrust Act that went against anti-monopolies. You see the name Sherman. You remember the Civil War general, William Tecumseh Sherman? Well, this was his younger brother, Robert Sherman, senator from Ohio, and considered to be a rising star in the Republican Party. You had a Silver Purchase Act to give farmers relief so that there could be more cash put into circulation. All of this comes about as part of the populist upsurge of the 1890s, in which the GOP loses a number of seats in the election of 1890 to the populists. When 1892 comes around, Benjamin Harrison, who was seen as being nothing more than a caretaker president and in the pocket of big businesses, was challenged once again by Grover Cleveland. Weaver, of course, representing the populists, split enough votes off of the GOP to help Cleveland win the White House back. And so Grover Cleveland is the 22nd president, but he is also the 24th president. He is the only man to have served 2 non-consecutive terms. That's why you've had 44 men to be president, but we've had 45 presidents, technically. In the process, the Democrats also take control of Congress. And there you see the electoral breakdown of the election of 1892. Imagine that. In 1888, Cleveland won the popular vote but didn't win the electoral vote. Well, it seems that happens now more often than we know. And he wins an even larger chunk of the electoral vote in 1892 and a larger chunk of the popular vote as well. In 1893, the country endured a pretty serious depression called the Panic of 1893. And the panic more refers to sort of a domino effect among businesses that began with the bankruptcy of the Reading Railroad. You will remember that on your Monopoly boards. Reading is one of the 4 railroads on there, along with the B&O, Short Line, and Pennsylvania railroads. This caused a number of businesses to also go bankrupt because railroads, remember, are very much tied into other businesses. As a result, the depression that followed saw an outflow of gold reserves from this country as it went to go pay off its debts, and 1/3 unemployment in the country. Those that remained employed saw their wages either reduced or frozen, and also had their hours cut back. As is always the case, depression hits farmers most of all. And Coxey's army was a strike or a march of farmers who marched from Ohio to Washington. That was to protest their situation. Jacob Coxey was the leader, and they called themselves the Army of the Commonwealth in Christ, and the nickname came from its leader and was more enduring. It was the first significant popular protest march on Washington, and the motto was "Enough food to feed Coxey's army," which became sort of a slogan later on. In addition to this, you had labor unrest. You had the Homestead Strike, which was a steel strike that began at the Homestead Iron Works in Homestead, Pennsylvania, as a protest of a wage cut. And so this was a serious strike. And then you had the Pullman Strike, which was a strike between the American Railway Union against the Pullman Company. And it brought the federal government into play yet again. Among the great labor leaders of the time was one of the true socialist candidates of the time, and that was Eugene Victor Debs. Eugene Debs was a major labor organizer. He created and formed the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, who got the nickname Wobblies, and nobody really knows why. It seems to have just originated. The problem is that the Depression weakened the unions. The Depression was so bad that it undermined Grover Cleveland's ability to even get the nomination of his party. When the election of 1896 came along, William Jennings Bryan of the Democratic Party was a 36-year-old up-and-coming operative, but nobody really gave him much thought as a major national candidate. He was already given the nickname the Great Commoner because of his forceful style and his appeal to the people. But when he got up to give his speech at the Democratic National Convention, he said basically that he would not yield to the interests of the gold standard, that money needed to be more prevalent in the United States, and he says, "I will not be crucified on this cross of gold." It was a pro-silver campaign speech. Immediately the Democratic Party says, "We have our candidate." Now, Republicans, of course, criticized him right away for being what they called sacrilegious. It was, of course, pious outrage and fabricated, outrage and so forth. The Republicans chose Senator William McKinley of Ohio, who ran what is known as a front porch campaign. A front porch campaign means you sit on your porch and you keep your mouth shut. You look good for the cameras, and that's it. When you did speak, you spoke in scripted messages, well rehearsed in advance. And he ran a pro-gold campaign. See, political campaigns back then are much different than they are today, where the candidate is sort of the central star of the show. Back then, the candidate, of course, was obviously very important, but it's really the operatives that are the stars of the show. They're the ones that get out there and do what they have to do. And William McKinley's big-time political guru, sort of like the Karl Rove of his day, was Marcus Hanna himself, a formidable politician. Well, McKinley's age and experience and his congenial nature and Marcus Hanna's very hard driving politics really push him over the top. McKinley wins 61% of the electoral vote. He trounces Bryan. And the Republican Party and Thomas Reed once again returns to power in Congress. Well, from this point onward, the Democrats now begin to reconfigure themselves and begin to become the Democratic Party that we know today. A more active government Democratic Party. This is, of course, a cartoon lampooning Marcus Hanna and McKinley, sort of satirizing or taking off from Oliver Twist and saying, "Please, mister, may I have the core?" And Hanna, of course, a bit bloated and overweight, chomping at the apple, saying, "Get away, boy, it ain't going to be no core." As the United States was beginning to feel itself become a great power, many people expressed their theories on how to project to that power. How does a nation project its power? And since 70% of the globe is covered with water, those like Alfred Thayer Mahan, you see in the picture there, advocated naval power. A navy is the best projection of a nation's power. And that with a navy, a strong navy, America can look outward. We can bring the flag to other peoples. We can bring Americanism to other peoples. Well, this starts with Hawaii in 1898. Now remember that Hawaii had petitioned to come in for annexation in 1893, and Grover Cleveland really wanted to do that, but it doesn't happen. William McKinley, however, manages to make it happen. Why? Because the whites that lived in Hawaii were able to couch the argument in such a way to say that don't let us whites be overwhelmed by the darker skinned peoples of Hawaii. And when they did that, the United States said, and the politicians said, okay, let's go get them. And so Hawaii becomes a U.S. possession in 1898, and the Japanese take a look at that and they say, the Americans are getting closer to our traditional sphere of activity. There's also a great deal of tension in Latin America. A rebellion broke out in Chile. There was a border dispute between the British and Venezuela in the region known as Guyana. And then in 1898, the Cubans went into revolt against their Spanish overlords. The fact that Spain was 90 miles off the coast of the United States proved to be a big political thorn in the side for many Americans. And many felt that Spain had no more business being in the New World. It was time for them to get out. And so the political presses of the day practiced what was known as yellow journalism. And yellow journalism means very hyperbolized, very sensationalized journalism. For instance, some person trips on a pothole in the city and falls down. Yellow journalism is going to say, okay, what politician created that pothole by keeping funds away, and what's the nefarious purpose, and so forth. And yellow journalism really takes a aim at Spain, especially the two great journalists of the day, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, after whom the prize is named. It's the press that brings us into a war with Spain in April and August of 1898. McKinley orders the USS Maine, an American naval battleship, to go to Havana as a symbol of security and stability. Now remember, we are sending our warship, a projection of our national power, into the harbor of a country run by another sovereign nation. And that is going to be seen by many as an aggressive act. And the USS Maine explodes. Immediately people start looking for blame, and they say it's the Spanish that did it. The Spanish that did it. Hearst and Pulitzer say, the Spanish did it. We need to go to war with the Spanish. Well, in truth, it was the Cuban revolutionaries that had blown up the Maine and killed all the sailors aboard. And we played right into their hands. Okay, so now we start debating. Okay, we're going to go to war with Spain. But remember, we're the United States of America. We're the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And so you have the Teller Amendment. And the Teller Amendment states that we are going to go to war. We're going to go to war to free Cuba, right? Everybody says, right. We're not going to war to take territory away from Cuba. Right. And so it was agreed. It was a joint resolution on April the 20th, 1898, in reply to the war message of William McKinley. It stated that the United States cannot annex Cuba, but only leave control of the island to its people. In short, the United States would help Cuba gain independence and then withdraw all of its troops from the country. That was the Teller Amendment. Very, very important. The Spanish, of course, trade insults with us and then declare war on the United States. And so, April to August of 1898, we are at war with Spain. There you see the wreckage of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. Immediately, Americans and the Hearst and Pulitzer papers are going around saying, remember the Maine, just like remember the Alamo. I believe that you all have gathered that I am a big fan of the Irish. I'm also a big fan of movies, in case you hadn't noticed. And in looking at William Randolph Hearst, who is on the left, I must recommend the greatest movie in all American history, and that is Citizen Kane, the story of a man named Charles Foster Kane, loosely based on William Randolph Hearst. On the right is the great Joseph Pulitzer. Remember, the idea of a newspaper is to sell newspapers. And so if the news is bland, well, you just fix it up. And all you got to do is look at the blogs of today to understand how Hearst and Pulitzer thought. There's another reason why we went to war. An author by the name of Kristen Hoganson wrote a book about the Spanish-American War and the exposition of 1890 and so forth, called Fighting for American Manhood. One of the reasons why we went to war was not so much out of a sense of duty to the Cuban people. It was not out of any sense of, helping injustices throughout the world. It was a sense that the men who were in Congress and the leaders in the states and in civic leaders throughout the country, they were the generation after the Civil War veterans. In other words, they had been young children or had not even been born at the time of the Civil War and had to grow up listening to the tales of their fathers and grandfathers and aunts and uncles about the good old, or I should say just the uncles, about the good old Civil War days in which they became men. And there was a strong, strong sentiment among many that war is very necessary for you to prove your manhood, to stake your legacy in the world. And that's one of the reasons why we went to war with Spain, is that you literally had people that were saying, this is necessary for us. We need to have a war, and a war will define us, especially when we win. And so that's why we go to war. Now, what are the theaters of war? Cuba, obviously, and also the Philippines. We're going to dismantle the Spanish Imperial Empire once and for all. And the Philippines were out in the east. This is where we send Commodore George Dewey, who you see there. Dewey had been a cabin boy during the Civil War. And he served under Admiral David Glasgow Farragut during the Civil War, who himself had been a cabin boy in the War of 1812. It is Dewey who destroys the Spanish Pacific Fleet and captures Manila in the Philippines, giving the famous order, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." So Dewey's one of the first big stars of the Spanish-American War. The next big star is a guy who was definitely out to prove his manhood, and that was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the McKinley cabinet, but he resigns his position and forms a regiment called the Rough Riders. And there they take part in the battles of Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill, the famous charge up San Juan Hill. And if you listen to the press and the early history accounts of it, you'd say that the Rough Riders charged up, outmanned and outgunned, and still took San Juan Hill. In truth, it was the Buffalo Soldiers who took Kettle and San Juan Hill with the help of the Rough Riders. But the Buffalo Soldiers are black, and so they did not get the press that they deserved. Instead, it was Theodore Roosevelt who became a national hero, and many said, "Ooh, McKinley, you got to put him on the ticket as your vice president." We win. We win the war. The Spanish sent their quote-unquote vast armada to the Caribbean to fight the U.S. Navy. The Hearst and Pulitzer yellow journalism's empires went to work stoking up fears along the East Coast that the vast Spanish armada was coming. And when they finally came over the horizon, what they found was just a few decrepit ships that they sent to the bottom of the Caribbean within 15 minutes. And the war was over in 3 months. What the war had proven, though, is that the Americans were grossly unprepared for the war. First of all, the Army. Most of the Army was out west still on the frontier, making sure that the Indians were behaving. That was the first problem. Secondly, instead of using the port of New Orleans, which would have been much, much better as a supply depot, they used the port of Tampa, Florida, which had only one rail line in and out, which caused terrible, terrible supply blockages. And Americans had no idea of how to make camps and training camps and so forth. And so the Americans needed to turn to some organization that knew how to use logistics and rails and setting up tents and moving large quantities of all sorts of things from place to place. And who did they turn to but the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus to learn how to set up and tear down camps and operate logistics. The treaty that the United States signs with Spain is called the Treaty of Paris of 1898, in which the United States now takes over the Spanish Empire, and it's now the American Empire. And the Senate debates long and hard, because many were saying, is this who we want to be as a nation? We had never been this way before. Now we're extending outward. Others said, times change, and we should too. This map here will show you the acquisitions of the United States. We take Puerto Rico, the Hawaiian Islands prior to the Spanish War, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, American Samoa. We have a strong presence in the Pacific, and the Japanese are concerned about this. The prime piece of real estate that we take in the Pacific is the Philippines, and what you're seeing here is a satellite map of the entrance to Manila Bay. Manila Bay is in your upper right-hand corner, and the Pacific is out to the bottom left. And that island in the middle that looks like a sperm, and that's what it looks like, is called Corregidor. And what you actually see there is you can see very faintly the outline of a volcanic caldera right in the middle of the bay, right there. And what looks like a giant sperm whale in the upper left, about to swallow Corregidor, that is the peninsula that is known as Bataan. And Bataan and Corregidor are going to become very, very important in the next 50 years. With the seizure of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, the United States becomes an imperial power. This is a major shift in U.S. foreign policy. We take the Philippines. The Filipinos had been fighting against the Spanish. Now they're going to start fighting against the Americans, led by Emilio Aguinaldo. One of the first men that is sent there to become governor is Arthur MacArthur, whose son Douglas would serve in the Second World War, and he was succeeded by William Howard Taft as the civilian governor of the Philippines. We also have a tremendous presence in Cuba and Puerto Rico. The Platt Amendment authorizes us to stay in Cuba and allows us to hold on to Guantanamo Bay. And that's why we have Gitmo to this day. The Florida Act allows us to take Puerto Rico. And wherever we go, the question begins to arise. Well, the people that are living there, does the Constitution apply to them? Some say no, it doesn't apply to them. They're not fully American citizens. Others said, wait a minute. Where the flag goes, the Constitution should go. And the insular cases decide the Constitution follows the flag. And so the Bill of Rights applies to the people that live under the American flag. We have the Philippines, we have Wake Island, we have Midway in Hawaii. But what's the real prize here? The real prize here is China. China is the key. China is the place teeming with people, which means open markets. New markets to have all those industrial goods we're making. We're not just selling it to Europe, we also want to sell it to the Chinese. And so John Hay, the man you see in the picture there, who, as he gets older, you see him as a young man, but now you see him older, he is Abraham Lincoln's secretary as a young man. Well, he will then continue on in government, become Secretary of State. He crafts what are known as the open door notes. The open door notes essentially say, look, China is open for marketing. It is not open for colonization. The European powers, we need to just simply share China when it comes to establishing markets there. That's the big thing. Now, not all the Chinese were happy about this. In 1899, an organization rose up that called itself the Society of Harmonious and Righteous Fists, who engaged in ritual boxing with the idea that ritual boxing could deflect the bullets of Westerners. They were wrong. The Boxer Rebellion, however, united the United States, France, Britain, and Germany to go and invade China for a short time and put down the rebellion to keep China open. This is where the Kaiser of Germany makes his infamous statement that the Chinese will feel the power of the Hun. And so the British now, from that point onward, start calling the Germans the Huns. The war also is important because Theodore Roosevelt emerges out of it. Being such a superstar, a military hero that he was, McKinley jettisoned his old vice president and put Roosevelt on the ticket in 1900. What a fateful decision that was, because Theodore Roosevelt ascends to the presidency on the assassination of William McKinley in 1901.